You've probably seen this tip. If you don't have any cake flour, substitute 2 tablespoons out of 1 cup of all-purpose flour with cornstarch. Now, I've been blindly following this advice for many years now because the surface logic of it is relatively sound. Cornstarch has 0% gluten-forming proteins, and using a little bit of that in your all-purpose flour decreases the overall content of gluten-forming proteins. Now, those proteins are responsible for forming gluten, which is a structural protein scaffold that we typically like in breads and pizza doughs and things like that, but we don't like them in cakes because sometimes they can be chewy and that's not a texture that we're going for. And recently I realized that something was a little bit off with this idea. And I started to notice this kind of dry, sandy, grainy texture in the cake crumb. The more I looked into it, I realized that cornstarch is quite possibly one of the worst starches I can use in a cake. Okay, let me explain what's going on. If you've ever cooked rice, stored it in the fridge, the next day when you take it out, it kind of has this dry texture. It's very brittle, maybe kind of chalky. That rice has undergone starch retrogradation. So why is this important to us as bakers? Well, starch retrogradation is the underlying mechanism that causes things that have starch in them, not just rice, but breads and cakes and things like that, to dry out and feel and taste stale. Okay, specifically with cakes, when we bake a cake, the starches within the batter, as they heat up, soak up water and they swell. You know those little toys, they're like pills and there's like a sponge inside, and when you add water, they expand. My kids love playing with those things, but imagine those sponges are like noodles. That's kind of what's happening. These things expand and they soak up water and they're kind of scattered everywhere. There's multiple, noodles floating around kind of randomly. That's what gives cakes that fluffy and soft texture. Now, as the cake cools down, these noodly things, they're called starch molecules, they like to rearrange themselves back into their initial position. So initially they were kind of tight in what's called these granules. And so they're gonna try to get back to that situation. Although they can't quite get, compressed, they're gonna try to line back up. This process is called retrogradation, and that's what's giving cakes that grainy, or breads or whatever, that grainy and kind of sandy texture. Now, there are 2 main starch molecules, and the way that I like to remember it is that amylose is the shorter word. And so in my head, I'm thinking of these short, stubby sticks that can stack onto each other really easily. Therefore, it retrogrades more quickly. Amylopectin is the longer word. They're actually called branch structures. So I'm thinking of a tree branch that has all these little, tiny branches on it. And because of that, it can't stack as easily and therefore retrogrades more slowly. Now, with that in mind, I'll show you 9 cakes, each made with different flour and starch combos, and share their gluten-forming protein in amylose percentages. I'll walk you through their textures at 2, 24, and 48 hours post-baking, and let's see if we can connect it to what we've learned about starch retrogradation. Okay, let's start with cake 1, which uses unbleached all-purpose flour. This is what most bakers have on hand, so it's a good baseline. The total percentages in the cake are 11% protein and 23% amylose. Right after baking, the crumb was coarse, but it wasn't too mealy. However, after 24 to 48 hours, it developed a noticeable graininess. Cake 2 uses unbleached cake flour, which has a lower protein content at 7% and is more finely milled. So as expected, the crumb was finer. And because cake flour is often made with a different type of softer wheat, so it has a lower amylose percentage, with this one averaging around 20%. However, it still developed a gritty texture within 24 to 48 hours, though it was slightly less pronounced than cake 1. Cake 3 uses bleached cake flour, which is common in the US. It's chemically treated to whiten and absorb water more easily, and this gave the cake a very slightly fluffier crumb. But because the protein and amylose levels are similar to the unbleached cake flour, the staling behavior was nearly identical. Cake 4 used the classic tip of mixing a little bit of cornstarch with all-purpose flour. And compared to the cake that used only all-purpose flour, adding that bit of cornstarch dropped the protein content only by 1.5%, from 11 to 9%. 9.5% and raised the amylose from 23 to 24%. And even though that seems really minor, it's only 1% difference, it was significant enough to cause a textural difference for me, which makes me wonder if the 1.5% drop in protein outweighs the increase in graininess that was apparent even within the first day of baking the cake. Cake 5 combined cake flour and cornstarch. It's what I use in my original chiffon recipe. With this, the protein dropped to 6% and the amylose rose 1% again, just like the previous example with all-purpose flour. The initial result was soft with a fine crumb, but it began to turn mealy within the same day. Cake 6 paired bleached cake flour with instant clear gel. And this one had a low protein and low amylose, but the texture was very dense and gummy, and that's because instant clear gel contains modified starches, which don't require heat to thicken, and what's happening is that it's doing that before the cake has a chance to rise. Though I do think I can fix this with some ratio adjustments. Cake 7 uses bleached cake flour and potato starch. The protein and amylose percentages were both reduced, and this one stayed soft through the 48-hour test with only the slightest hint of mealiness at the end. Cake 8 uses bleached cake flour and tapioca starch. The top layer of this one was lovely, but it developed this gummy layer on the bottom, possibly due to my mixing or a ratio issue that I have to fix. Cake 9 uses bleached cake flour and mochiko rice flour. It had a soft and spongy texture with the tiniest bit of chew and was very tender from the 2-hour mark all the way up to 48 hours. And this one was noticeably more moist than the other cakes. Okay, so what is my takeaway from all these results? If you're going to bake a cake or maybe anything else that uses cake flour, or you're going to make your own cake flour, or you have a recipe like mine that uses cake flour and then another starch, I want you to consider not only the protein content of those flours and starches, but their contribution to starch retrogradation. And the rule of thumb here is that the higher the amylose content in your flours and starches, the faster they will retrograde or stack onto each other. Because remember, they have that straight structure that allows them to stack onto each other more easily. And the faster your baked goods will stale. See, that's what was happening with my chiffon cake. I was adding all that cornstarch thinking that, lowering the gluten-forming protein content would increase the tenderness and fluffiness of my cake, which it did initially, but I was also at the same time increasing the rate of staling because of cornstarch's high amylose content. So in light of all that, here are some formulas I suggest that will improve the overall texture of your cake. My top choice for a cake flour substitute, or you can even do this with cake flour to get the fluffiest texture, is to add potato starch. It has a similar amylose content to cake flour, so it won't raise the total amylose level like cornstarch, and it also has 0% gluten-forming proteins, which lowers the overall gluten content. So to make this swap, I take 1 cup or 120 grams of all-purpose flour and then remove 2 tablespoons or 15 grams of it. I then replace it with the same amount of potato starch. Now don't use potato flour, that's made from whole dried potatoes. Potato starch is a fine white powder, which is pure amylose and amylopectin. Notice I'm using a scale here. The cup and the tablespoon measurements aren't going to be precise, particularly because I didn't aerate the flour before I used the volumetric measurements, so the weight is definitely going to be off. But if you're new to baking by weight and you need help using a scale, don't be afraid to ask. I'm happy to write something up because it is one of the biggest upgrades you can make in your baking. Okay, after that, I sift the blend and then I sift it again when I add it to my batter. Now, potato starch works great, but my favorite starch to use in this way is actually a glutinous rice flour. And I use the Mochiko brand. Now, glutinous is a confusing term. It doesn't mean that rice flour has gluten in it. It's actually gluten-free, but it refers to the texture, which is chewy and kind of gummy. It adds a touch of moisture and tenderness, which is what I really like about it. And it's almost the same formula. You remove 2 tablespoons or 15 grams of the all-purpose flour or cake flour, but since Mochiko is slightly heavier, I add back only 1.5 tablespoons, and that equals 15 grams. Again, this is where using a scale is going to be really helpful. Also, another important point that I want to bring up is that no matter what flour or starch mix that you use, the best way to store cakes and to prevent staling is to freeze them, which is what I do if I'm not using the cake layers within a couple of days. I think there's a common misconception, particularly among consumers, that a cake that is frozen is simply not as good. I posted a TikTok on this a while ago and people went off the wall bonkers saying, you know, they would never eat a frozen cake, they would never pay for a frozen cake, not knowing that a majority of the cakes are previously frozen. But the science behind it is that the starch molecules need water to rearrange themselves and retrograde and cause that kind of greeny texture. And so by freezing the cake, you freeze the water and stall that process. So unless you're lucky to have somebody bake and decorate and serve you a cake within the same day, I do highly recommend freezing your cake layers. Now, one last quick note, I did accidentally stumble upon a way to prevent staling and retrogradation in cakes, and that is to use a high amount of acid in the cake batter. I'm reading that that's also preventing the starch molecules from realigning, but this doesn't really make sense if you're trying to make a chocolate cake or a vanilla cake. No one wants those to be terribly sour. I just happen to be developing my lemon cake recipe, which uses a ton of lemon juice. It's super sour, but what happens is that the cake crumb is so tender, even a week later, it tastes just as good as it did maybe on like day 2 or day 3. It's pretty incredible. Still working on it, and I will post when I get that done.